Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto, attorney at law in the state of Michigan. Today we're going to talk about how you can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater. Every time I mention that concept, and I've mentioned it a couple times, someone always chimes in and says, yes, I can. The First Amendment says I can. Or they'll say, there's no law against it. So we'll talk about that in a second. But the idea of falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater comes up because I've mentioned before I've written a couple books about the Italian Hall disaster. 1913, during a children's Christmas party on Christmas Eve, someone ran into the crowded Italian hall and yelled fire and caused a panic when there was no fire. 73 people died, and I've mentioned that before because this chair and this block of wood are from the Italian Hall. But I've written a couple books about it as well. I wrote a book called Death's Door, The Truth Behind Michigan's Largest Mass Murder. And then I also wrote a follow-up to that in 2013, the Centennial, a little bit thicker of a book. Death's Door now is subtitled The Truth Behind the Italian Hall Disaster and the Strike of 1913. And a little while ago, I was on the internet doing research, and I'm always researching. There's a couple topics I never stop researching. The Italian Hall, turbine cars, Tucker. And I ran across an article that mentioned me by name, which perked my ears up. And so I found an article written by a guy named Carlton Larson, who is a law professor at UC Davis School of Law. And he wrote an article called Shouting Fire in a Theater, The Life and Times of Constitutional Law's Most Enduring Analogy. And so he wrote this article, and he cited me in the article in the footnote something like 26 times. So I sent him a note after reading the article, and he sent me a note back, and we corresponded a little bit. And he sent me a copy, a signed copy, a bound signed copy of the article. And he inscribed it for Steve Lehto with deep admiration for your scholarship. So very, very nice of him to do that, and I appreciate that. And the article is fascinating for those of you who are interested in constitutional law, because he does something here that's fairly uncommon for a law review article. Most law review articles are very, very thick, dense reading where they talk about some minutia of a statute that only three people care about. One of them is the author. And here he's talking about this idea about where this phrase came from and kind of how it evolved over time. And the idea about, yelling fire in a crowded theater, which is how most people put it, it's actually falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater. And the saying kind of morphs because people like to say things that are easier to say. So they often drop words and so on. And obviously, you could yell fire in a crowded theater if there was a fire. It's falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater. And then, of course, it doesn't have to be a theater. The Italian Hall wasn't technically a theater. I mean, it was a building with a stage and seats, but it was never called a theater. It was called the Italian Hall. Now, one of the things that Professor Larson points out is there's been some debate about what inspired Oliver Wendell Holmes to say what he said. So in case you don't know this, it was in 1919, a case called Schenck versus U.S., where there was a discussion about whether there are any limitations on free speech. Your free speech rights come from the First Amendment. And so the question is, are you free to say anything you want at any time you want? And Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. That is a direct quote from Schenck versus U.S. at page 52. And so that phrase, like I said, is morphed over time into just, yelling fire in a crowded theater or shouting fire in a theater. And so the question has always been, where did that come from? And I always noticed that it happened in 1919, that Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that. And I believe myself, and this is a personal belief of mine, and we'll get into why, I can't prove this, but I personally believe that Oliver Wendell Holmes was either partially inspired by, or at least he knew about the Italian Hall disaster, and that may have been part of his inspiration. Because the Italian Hall disaster happened in 1913, and Schenck was written in 1919, just 6 years later. And you say, but Steve, the Italian Hall disaster happened way, way up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in a little town called Calumet, which at the time was called Red Jacket. And how would somebody in Washington, D.C. even know about the Italian Hall disaster? And I like to point out to people that if you go back and look, if you ever find yourself in a room with microfiche readers and rolls of microfiche of old newspapers, pick any newspaper you want from America, Australia, England, other countries with the English language. and look at Christmas Day 1913 or the days following, depending on how far away they are for the news to travel, you'll find that the Italian Hall disaster was front page news everywhere. Now, I don't have a copy with me of the New York Times, but I do have a copy with me of the Detroit News. And this is the Detroit News actual Christmas edition, Christmas Day 1913. I'm sure there's going to be a glare on here from my cameras or my lights, and I apologize. I might have a better print of this I can put at the end of the video. But this is Christmas Day, 1913, Detroit News. Copper Country officers seek man who cried fire, 80 dead. Now that number's off, it was 73. Little children of miners are trampled to death and suffocated in wild panic. And then there's a whole story here about Christmas tree entertainment is turned into tragedy. Hall piled high with bodies, frantic mothers fight for their dead. Women labor bravely to hold back excited throng. And men crushed as they endeavor to stem stampede. Lives snuffed out before fear is even felt. Few use fire escapes. So this is the Detroit News front page. Got that off eBay. Where else? But I've seen the New York Times, for instance. And the New York Times had this story front page above the fold on Christmas Day. And most newspapers across America covered the story. Now, the one thing that Professor Lawson disagrees with me on, Larson, I keep saying Lawson. That's Larson. I should know this by now. Is he says that he thinks it was inspired by something else. And it's a very good argument, and I'll tell you about this just because it's an interesting argument. Is that Schenck versus U.S. was the Supreme Court case, okay, involving the Espionage Act. And there was actually a trial of a socialist named Eugene Debs that happened in 1918. And the prosecuting attorney in that case was named Edwin Wirtz. And in his closing argument to the jury, Wirtz said, "A man in a crowded auditorium or any theater who yells fire, and there is no fire, and a panic ensues and someone is trampled to death, may be rightfully indicted and charged with murder." And so Mr. Larson, Professor Larson, thinks, and I see the argument here, thinks that Wirtz may have been what put the idea in Holmes's mind of this idea when it comes to the use of wild language, and likening it to somebody yelling fire in a crowded theater. And of course, I don't think we know where Wirtz got his inspiration from, though, and that'd be 1918. Okay, so the interesting thing that Professor Larson does, and I'm only going to summarize this very, very briefly, is he points out how throughout history there were all kinds of examples of people yelling fire falsely in crowded theaters and people dying. So, for instance, in 1876, in Cincinnati Opera House, someone shouted fire, 2,500 people, mostly women and children, 8 people trampled to death. In 1889, a false shout of fire at a Johnstown, Pennsylvania Opera House led to the deaths of at least 10 people and injured 50 more. In 1895, Front Street Theater in Baltimore, a patron erroneously shouted fire after seeing a gas jet being lit. 24 people trampled to death. In 1901, a boy falsely shouted fire during a theatrical performance at a building in Chicago. Killed 5 people. A month earlier, a performance in the same building had been interrupted by a false shout of fire, resulting in injuries to 18 people. They actually believe that there's a boy, for instance, in one of these stories who may have done it more than once, and he was just kind of enjoying it. On Easter Eve, 1906, a boy ran into a Catholic church in Chicago, shouted fire, and the panic killed 3 people, and so on. So the idea of false shouts of fire causing panic and harm and even death to people is weirdly very prevalent prior to 1900. It's actually kind of strange. But I would liken that. I wrote a book about murder houses in America and how many people were murdered with axes in the 1800s. And you don't hear about that nowadays as much. Okay, gun deaths get headlines, but you don't hear about axe murders all that often. And I was doing research on those. I'm going, whoa, look at all these axe murders. Well, again, people shouting fire falsely in crowded theaters was apparently almost like an epidemic, and it wasn't just in America. He points out they were equally problematic in the United Kingdom. In 1878, a British publication surveyed recent theater panics, all of which have been triggered by false shouts of fire, and gives some example. about, false cries of fire. And he also goes back, and this is the kind of stuff I absolutely love. He goes back and he finds a writing from 1723. That's a long time ago. Daniel Defoe argued, if it is criminal to cry fire in the city when there is no fire, because of the hurry and fright it puts the neighborhood into, if it be criminal in the camp for a sentinel upon duty to fire his musket when he is not attacked or sees no enemy, and he goes on and on, but he's clearly talking about the idea of falsely shouting fire being a problem. So it was widely recognized to the point where he even says that it became a point in some literary journals to simply talk about someone who cries fire is like a dangerous fool, okay? So I agree with all of this. There is actually this long history of people shouting fire falsely and people being injured thereby. But that gets us to, number one, do we know what inspired Oliver Wendell Holmes to say this? Well, even if he got it from the prosecutor who had said it more wordy than he had, I have to believe that Oliver Wendell Holmes would have known about the Italian Hall disaster. So if it was simply the Italian Hall disaster that inspired him to do it, probably not, because he'd seen this other guy mention it, and that may have been part of the inspiration also. But I suspect that if he's thinking about people falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, he's thinking about the examples where a lot of lives were lost. In the Italian Hall disaster, there were 73 lives lost. I'm not sure if there's any greater death counts in all the examples he gave. I didn't see any, but that would be an interesting question. But again, like here's one in Liverpool, 37 people, 16 deaths in another one, and so on. And the Italian Hall disaster would have been one of the most tragic, if you just simply go off the number of deaths. 73 people died there. And so I would suspect that he knew about the Italian Hall disaster, and if not being the only case, it was at least one of the cases that made him think, hey, yelling fire falsely in a crowded theater and a panic ensuing, yes, that's a dangerous form of speech. So the interesting thing is, like I said, anytime I mention the false cry of fire, someone always says, like I said, I'm allowed to say anything. The First Amendment says so. Well, the First Amendment's in the Constitution, Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments. And the Constitution says specifically that if there are arguments or debates about how any of the Constitution works, or any of the Bill of Rights, or any of the laws that get passed later, those are settled by the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes was writing for the Supreme Court when he said that. That was the Supreme Court interpretation of the First Amendment. So you do not have a First Amendment right to shout fire falsely in a crowded theater. Oliver Wendell Holmes says so, and that's exactly what he's talking about when he said you can't do that. But second of all, I hear from people occasionally who say, Steve, there is no law against it. Can you show me a law? Well, one of the interesting things, and I never really stopped to think about that because I wasn't aware off the top of my head of any laws, but in the article, Shouting Fire in a Theater, The Life and Times of Constitutional Law's Most Enduring Analogy by Carlton Larson, he points out that after some of these bad tragedies, some municipalities did in fact pass laws. Municipalities responded with provisions criminalizing false shouts of fire. As early as 1823, the city of Cincinnati enacted an ordinance to prevent false alarms of fire. 1917 Indianapolis Municipal Code made it a crime to cry out a false alarm of fire in any church, public hall, theater, moving picture showroom, or any other building of a similar or different character, while the same is occupied by a public assemblage. And so there have been laws passed about this. And some of these things were also brought up and tried in various courts along the way. But the interesting thing is, like I said, there have been laws passed. Is there a universal law where you can go and find a law on the books that says, where you are, you cannot do this? And no, I suspect there is no universal law on that. However, it's the reverse way of looking at it, because if you did it and people got injured, you could be prosecuted. You wouldn't be prosecuted for the act of the words you spoke. You'd be prosecuted for the fact that you did something dangerous or negligent or whatever you want to call it, and people died as a result. That's one of the reasons that the first edition of my book was called The Truth Behind Michigan's Largest Mass Murder. is that I argued that the man who cried fire and caused 73 people to die when there was no fire, and the man knew it, that he could have been tried for those deaths. Now, it wouldn't have been first-degree murder. He didn't go and say, I'm going to kill these 73 people. Didn't do that. But it was going to be a lesser form of murder based on the fact he made a reckless act and it caused people to die, for which he could have been tried. The man who did it got away with it. It's another story altogether. I wrote a chapter on that as well. And in fact, Professor Larson mentions my theory in his article. Unfortunately, he also mentions some other theories which are unfounded, but I won't get into that. One of these days, maybe on a casual Friday, I'll do a whole thing on the oddities of writing about local history when the people who still live there don't consider you a local. So I find that my book on the Italian Hall disaster is embraced by many people, but the people who don't embrace it the most are the ones who are closest to where it happened. And many of them hate my book, not because it's not correct, but because it came down on the side that they had not been raised to understand or appreciate. It's almost like a political question to them, even though it's been over 100 years. As time passes, I think that's going to change. But for the time being, there's always going to be people who just have their mindset. They don't want to hear the facts or anything like that. So, again, back to whether or not you can falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. And that's one of the things, by the way, that Professor Larson points out, is that the saying often gets shortened to you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And the real saying is you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. But it's a fascinating article. If I can find the link to it, I will stick it in the description below. And if you're in a history or law or legal history, it's a fairly short article. I mean, I see it's about 20 pages. It's got a bunch of footnotes, and if you dig through the footnotes, you'll see references to my book. Unfortunately, he misspells my name, and strangely, he misspells my first name. On page 191, he says Michigan attorney Stephen Lehto, and he spells it with a PH. And the funny thing is, if you look at anything of mine, you'll see that I don't use the N in Stephen. I only use Steve. And covers of both my books say Steve Lehto. And for whatever reason, I know a lot of scholarly journals and so on don't like to use abbreviations. So they may have considered Steve to be an abbreviation of Stephen. However, Steve is a name. And I've sat down with a court reporter before. I've stood up in open court before, and I say, Steve Lehto on behalf of the plaintiff. And the court reporter will say, how do you spell Stephen? And I go, Steve. And they always say, no. How do you spell Stephen? And I go, my name's not Stephen, it's Steve. And they go, well, what's your birth certificate name? And I go, wait, did you ask the last guy what his middle name was? Because that's on your birth certificate too. They guys go, fine, and they get upset. I don't know why. It's almost like an OCD thing where they got to have your legal name, even though that's not the name I use professionally. So anyways, great article by Carlton Larson, professor at UC Davis School of Law. I enjoyed it. You might enjoy it too. But the takeaway here is falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater is not good. It could kill people. It is something that Oliver Wendell Holmes talked about. You can't do it, even if you think the First Amendment protects you. And you shouldn't do it because it's probably illegal or will result in illegal things happening that you will be charged with, contrary to anything you think. Questions or comments, as always, shoot them my way. All the information is below. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.